Good evening, and welcome to this evening's episode of
In the Hood,
where we discuss crucial issues of church and culture from a Capuchin Franciscan perspective. I'm Brother Mark Schenk, the provincial minister of the Capuchin province of St. Conrad here in Denver.
I'm Father Christopher Gama. I'm the vicar pastor at our Capuchin parish here in Denver, Annunciation.
And we're very happy that you're with us here this evening for this very special episode of In the Hood. You may remember last month we said we were going to talk about the canonization of Blessed Carlo Acutis, but with the sudden death of Pope Francis on Monday, we decided that we needed to pivot a little bit and talk about the highlights of the papacy of Pope Francis and look forward a little bit to the election of the new Pope in the coming weeks. This is a live podcast, and so we invite your comments and your questions. You can send them in the group chat there on YouTube, or you can send them by email to inthehood@capuchins.org. So I think we can get right into it this evening, and we want to start with a prayer.
Sure. No, I think the thought that you had that we pivoted in our episode. I think it's a providential moment in time in church history. We just came out of the Easter Triduum, came out of Holy Week, and we learned about the sudden death of Pope Francis, so I think it's very appropriate to talk about his legacy tonight, and we welcome all of our viewers tonight, and so, it's a kind of sad and joyful moment encapsulated in one, so we definitely want to grieve the loss of a leader of the Catholic Church, but we also trust in our Lord and know in the coming weeks that God will guide us through that sorrowful loss. So, I could certainly begin with a prayer. Let's pray together in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God, Heavenly Father, faithful of and rewarder of all souls, we grant that your departed servant, Pope Francis, whom you made the successor of St. Peter and the shepherd of your Catholic Church, may happily enjoy forever your presence in heaven, and the mysteries of your grace.
The Protestant Reformation, and so both the Jesuits and the Capuchins, along with some of the other orders, were very instrumental in the Counter-Reformation. And it's often been said that the Jesuits were the head of the Counter-Reformation, and the Capuchins were the heart of the Counter-Reformation. Meaning, the Jesuits, they worked through education and sort of appealing to the intellect in working to win people back to the Catholic faith, where the Capuchins, they worked through their humility, through their service to the poor. They worked through gestures, perhaps more than words, and so it was to appeal to the heart. Now, it's an oversimplification, of course. I'm not suggesting that the Jesuits don't have hearts, but this was sort of the popular view of these two orders and how they worked in the Counter-Reformation. And it seems to me, it seemed to us, that Francis in very many ways operated as the Franciscan, in the sense that he often operated more through his gestures than through his words. And so that's what made us think of the Franciscan heart of a Jesuit pope.
Yeah. No, I think that's accurate in terms of kind of how God providentially raises up, apostles and new movements, new orders, throughout the history and salvation history of the church. And the Counter-Reformation orders, thanks be to God, are still present today. At that time, they were needed for the re-evangelization of the culture and of Europe and the New World. But what came to mind for me is my introduction to theology class. If we can imagine kind of a circular pie chart, right, separated into 4 sections, an X and Y axis. And on the Y-axis at the top is God reveals himself as truth, and the Y-axis at the bottom, God reveals himself as love. And the X-axis, you have the cataphatic tradition, God is revealed through imagery, and the apophatic tradition, God is revealed as mystery. And so that X and Y axis is kind of a paradox on the omnipotence of God, but the Jesuits kind of live in that top, upper quadrant with that speculative knowing of God, and the Franciscans kind of live on that bottom quarterly part of the pie chart, that God is encountered or experienced through the heart, right? And so both are necessary in terms of our understanding of who Jesus is and what's necessary. So I think Pope Francis encapsulates those two parts of the pie, that intellectual aspect of understanding who God is, and then also kind of the lived human fraternal experience and service and kind of praise of all creation of what God has revealed. So I like that summary.
Yeah. This is the 7th Pope in my lifetime, and the first Pope would have been Pius XII, who died when I was just a year old or so. So I never really knew anything about him until later on, of course. But I can remember the deaths of John the 23rd and Pius the sixth. Paul the Sixth, and John Paul the I, John Paul II, and Benedict. But and the loss of any pope, it always hits you, because it's a pivotal moment in the life of the church now, as we look sort of to the future and what do we want to do with this and what are we hoping for, and it gives you a chance to kind of look back on the legacy and how we've grown as a church and maybe how we've stumbled and so forth. But this one, the death of Francis hit me more than all the others because I knew him better, I think, than I did any of the others. And maybe I'll have a chance to talk about that later on in the show. But, he's the one I really felt like I, in a sense, knew him. I had very little short encounters with him, but it was just something about it that he felt more human to me,
No, that's interesting how we can, identify with, certain popes or certain religious figures. For myself, I haven't lived through that many popes. God willing, this will be my 4th. So John Paul II, Benedict, and now Francis. But for me, one of the things that's fascinating about a pope that dies, right, is the kind of legacy that they leave behind. And as a student of Christianity, one of the things that inspired me early on is the lives of the saints. And so we have many saints who were popes, and so to hear of their kind of heroic virtue throughout their pontificate. But one of the things that I kind of was moved by and struck by was John Paul II, because I was not only inspired by his personal holiness, but read his writings and would look forward to different teachings that came out throughout his pontificate. And one of the ones that struck me in seminary, or while I was in formation, is the encyclical on redemptive suffering. And so when I saw him kind of getting older in his pontificate and near his own death, he was living out his own teaching. And so that was really inspiring to me and kind of stirring within me a deeper desire to pursue holiness. And Francis has those qualities too, but I think I was more immersed in the intellectual life at that time when John Paul II was passing. So when he did pass, it was more of an emotional kind of grieving for me, because I felt like I was losing like a grandfatherly figure or a father figure. Pope Francis, I love very deeply, but he hasn't had the same impact on my day-to-day spiritual life that John Paul II did.
Yeah, I think that'd be true for a lot of people your generation. You know, that was. I mean, John Paul II was Pope for a long time, for one thing.
Yeah,
and he made it more of an effort to connect with youth than those before him. So yeah, I can really see that.
And he was kind of like a celebrity figure too.
Really,
you know, he had that charismatic kind of quality, and he never knew what was going to happen when he showed up in the crowd. You know, and so, but I think that's what we needed at the time, and during the cultural revolution, and then also now, God has blessed us with the pontificate of Pope Francis.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the highlights or the sort of the impactful moments in the life of Francis. That there were there's so many that it's hard to sort of choose, but the one that the first one that sort of comes to my mind is when he saw during one of his audiences, he saw a man in the crowd who had
cerebral
disease.
palsy.
It was neurofibromatosis, I think they called it. But he had these growths all over his face, and so he was, a little bit scary. Not that attractive, I guess you'd say. And Pope Francis went right out to him, made a beeline out there, and hugged him, and you had to, understand that this is probably the first time this man had been hugged in a long, long time, and they interviewed him afterward. They managed to find this and interviewed him, and he was shaken, in a good way by the encounter, and he said, when I was going home that day, I felt like I was 10 years younger. It's like a load had been lifted off of my shoulders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one thing that has certainly intrigued me during the pontificate of Pope Francis, is his emphasis on the dignity of the human person. I think that was one of the earlier podcasts that we kind of zoned in on in terms of his teaching. And looking back on some of those encounters early on in his pontificate, you could clearly see that was on his mind. That he wanted to proclaim to the world that every person has dignity, has value.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's so that going back to the title, I think that's one of those things where he could have written a whole encyclical about the dignity of the human person, but he almost said more in that one gesture than he could have said in a 30-page encyclical.
Right. Right. Yeah, I know some. I've heard comments that some Catholics are longing for more clear teaching from him, or wish that he gave us more kind of directives in terms of the maybe intellectual life of the church. But I think sometimes we need a good example of what teaching embodies through gesture, through not always using words to preach, but actions. Yeah. And so I think he was a good example of that. Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that I remember early on when he was elected Pope is choosing the name of Francis. I know early on in his, when they announced who was chosen as Pope, every Pope gets to choose a name, and he kind of broke tradition by choosing Francis, because there's never been a Pope Francis. So everybody on the Fox News or whatever news channels were on at the time, they were all saying, well, he chose the name of Francis Xavier. Right. And I knew in my heart, I was like, I don't think it's Xavier. It's got to be Francis of Assisi, And certain enough, or sure enough, he chose Francis of Assisi. So I was moved. I was very, very excited and happy that he chose his patron saint in his pontificate of St. Francis. And then shortly after that, he started to do some things that really shook things up. He didn't want any driver, or he would kind of take the bus to certain places, just live that kind of simplicity in a pontificate. And as a political religious leader, I would imagine that would have been very difficult to hold the line on some of those things. Because you have people constantly wanting to serve you, but he lived the example of servant.
Right. Yeah. Another episode that comes to my mind, and it was very sort of controversial, and I mean, there was one group of people that were overjoyed by it, another group of people who were a little bit consternated about it, and it's when he was on a plane, and somebody asked him about a priest who had identified as gay, and he uttered that line, which probably will go down in history. Who am I to judge? Said, if he's trying, if he has a good will, if he's trying to live a good life, who am I to judge this person? And so they shouldn't be marginalized. They need to be integrated into society. And I think that just, I mean, it showed the kind of the merciful heart of Pope Francis.
Yeah, I saw an Instagram reel similar to the story you mentioned last night as we were kind of preparing for the show. I think there's a papal audience that's occurring on the clip, but there's a African American man, and he's speaking either Italian or Italian or Spanish. I'm not quite sure, but the reel is translated, and he's speaking to the Pope in kind of a private audience, but there's other people in the room, there's other cardinals in the room, and he himself says, I feel excluded by the church as a gay man. I don't feel welcomed, I don't feel seen and loved. And so what advice would you give me? And he asks this directly to Pope Francis, and Pope Francis thinks about it and kind of is taken back by how important this moment is. And he says, I would ask you to put your emphasis on the noun rather than the adjective of the way that you described yourself. And he says, you are a man first. And when you live out of the identity of the noun, that's where you're going to find your dignity. Right? And the man just, his tenseness, his anxiety, his stress just crumbled. Wow. And he began to sob with just mercy, that compassion. And Pope Francis, just had that presence about him just to kind of take the tension out of the room with that sense of dignity and mercy that you're talking about. And so I think, again, that's modeling for us what some of our teaching looks like.
Yeah. Are there any other moments in his life that come to your mind that...
I saw him one time when I was a brand new priest in this would have been 2013, I guess, 2013. So I was blessed to be able to go to one World Youth Day, actually two, one before I was a priest with the Capuchins. But I took a parish here in Denver, Spirit of Christ, so shout out to Spirit of Christ Parish. And we went to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and I have very positive memories, but I also have very stressful memories because at the closing mass, there was 4 million people on the beach of Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro. So it's hard to imagine, but Google what the aerial footage of that looks like. But just remember him coming into the crowd the first time we gathered on the beach, and you could feel kind of the wave of like his helicopter kind of coming in and the cheering. And once he landed, it was about an hour transition from him landing at the airport or wherever the helicopter was landing for him driving into the Pope Mobile. And you could just see the people kind of running up to the main road that they had barricaded, and just all the people wanting just to get a glimpse of him. And so I was probably, 4 rows behind the main barricade of people. So I could clearly see when he came in, and just the joy on his face of not only being elected new Pope, but just the excitement that you could see in his eyes for being with all of God's people. And so that for me was a divine moment, because how often do you get to see in the flesh, right, the successor of Peter? I've been asked, multiple times as a Catholic, Father, have you ever gotten to see the Pope? And I mean, statistically, that's like hitting the lottery. I know you've hit the lottery twice, right? But it's literally like getting to see the President of the United States. Not everybody has that opportunity, but that was my closest kind of moment of encounter of just remembering him. So yeah, a joyful moment for sure.
Yeah. That's the time. I think they actually got lost, or the driver took the wrong route or something like that, and they got stuck in the crowd and they couldn't move, and that was.
Hopefully he kept his job after that. The driver, I mean.
There's another episode in his life, when the time that he came to the United States, visited the United States, and he went to Washington D.C. and the normal thing, it's like the visit of a diplomat,
Right.
A diplomatic visit. So you'd go and you'd meet the president, you'd meet groups of politicians and muckety mucks high up. Instead of doing that sort of thing, I mean, he did that as well. But one of the things he did, which was very unusual, is that he went to a soup kitchen, to a homeless shelter, and spent time. He had dinner with these 300 homeless people,
right.
drug
That's
addicts
right.
and victims of domestic abuse and what have you, homeless people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was, that gesture was just, that these people matter as much as the muckety mucks.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't he one of the first pontiffs to kind of break tradition of the washing of the feet? And he went to either a women's prison or kind of a Muslim prison.
Right. They would have,
during Holy.
they normally would have done the Holy Thursday service in the Vatican, and he would have
Right.
washed the feet of 12 clergy members, and instead he
Mhm.
went to the prison,
Mhm.
one of the most notorious prisons in Rome, and washed the feet of 12 prisoners, some of whom were Muslims and
Mhm.
some who were women. Yeah, that caused quite a stir.
Yeah. That's another memory that I remember early on his pontificate. There was a lot of people that were unnerved by that, and some people very touched by that.
Right. Yeah. And then once he went to the Greek island of Lesbos, and to meet with the refugees there. And it's, of course, refugees was one of the groups of people that Francis talked most often about, and was advocated for were refugees. And so he talked there on this Greek island about the refugees crisis and the need to welcome refugees. But more than just talk about it, he brought 12 refugees back to Rome with him. They were Muslim families who had to flee from their homes in Syria because of the war there. And he actually put them up in Vatican-owned properties in Rome. And as far as I know, those 12 people, they're still living in Rome to this day. So again, that gesture, which speaks louder than words.
Yeah. No, I'm sure we all have our kind of moments where we were either, just taken back by kind of how God used him in our time, in our world. And I think one of the interesting aspects, maybe that we often take for granted from the transition of Pope Benedict to Pope Francis, I think Pope Benedict, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was one of the first popes ever to have a Twitter account. And then he shortly stepped down, and then Pope Francis was the one to take over that. So he became kind of the first modern pope to interact in a regular way in the digital world. And so to me, that was another insightful moment of like, wow, we get to interact with a pontiff in some way, whereas in the ancient world, you would have to, take the time to write a letter and send it by horseback to, the Holy See. And maybe in 6 years you might get a response back, but I'm sure it was quicker than that in the ancient world. But, the possibility to interact and interface with a modern pope, I think is that's the first time in my knowledge that's happened.
Yeah. I think the Vatican has always been sort of on the cutting edge. Somewhat. I think they were the first in Italy to use radio, for instance, and television. They tried to get in. Communication is very important for evangelization. So
Right.
they spent actually a lot of money. A large part of the budget of the Vatican goes to Vatican Radio, which is transmitted all around the world in, I don't know, dozens of languages. And they don't shy away from that, because they know that that's part of evangelization, is communication. And so
Yeah. But going back just briefly to our comment about him kind of going outside of the box and on Holy Thursday, somebody mentioned in the comments there that this Holy Thursday he met at the Regina Coeli prison with 70 inmates despite his health conditions, which that in and of itself is amazing.
Right.
You know, so
he was, much like John Paul II, who never wanted to give up the cross. He carried the cross of the papacy right till the end. And Francis did too. And in a sense, I think it killed Francis, perhaps. Because his doctors, of course, told him that he needed rest for 2 months, and that lasted about 2 days.
Well, didn't he have some health conditions as a young man? I know some people say he only had one lung, or he had a lung removed as a young person.
He had a part of one lung removed. Yeah, so he's always been susceptible to problems with his lungs. So he contracted pneumonia this time. And
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that in and of itself is inspiring to me. As a young priest at a parish, just, one of the things I struggle with is finding the energy to meet all the needs and of the encounters that you have just in one day. I can't imagine just that multiplied at the level of Pontiff every single day, of all the thousands of people that, want your time and attention, and not having one lung or a partial lung removed, and having that energy just to continue the ministry of Christ. That in and of itself for me is inspiring.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I was going to say this later, when we get into the conclave, but I don't know who would want that job. I mean, when you think about it, when you become Pope, your life is basically over. Your life, the way you wanted to live it, is over, because every moment of your life is now controlled, in a sense. You can't just go out one night for pizza and beer if you feel like it. So
I've seen pictures of Pope Benedict drinking a beer, but maybe that was before he was Pope.
Well,
so.
that might
and he's
have been,
German too.
That might have been in the Vatican. Get
That's
takeout,
true.
maybe.
We can order in some good Chinese, maybe.
Right. Yeah. But I think we should talk also about the relationship that Pope Francis had with the Capuchins.
Certainly, yeah.
I think there's a lot of connections there between Pope Francis and the Capuchins. The first one that comes to my mind, is right, 2 years into his papacy, he calls the special Jubilee year of the Year of Mercy, 2015. And a big emphasis of this Year of Mercy was on confession, on the sacrament of confession.
That's right.
And so, and this has been something he's continued on through his papacy, is reminding confessors that they are to have mercy, that they're not judges, they're not meant to come down hard on people, but they're meant to show mercy. And so for the culmination of this Year of Mercy, they wanted to have this big gathering in Rome of people, and they decided to bring the relics of 2 saints known for the mercy that they showed in the confessional to Rome for the veneration of the people. And the 2 saints that he chose were Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, most people know as Padre Pio, a Capuchin, and the other one was Saint Leopold of Mandich, also a Capuchin. And so the Capuchins, for him, sort of embodied this spirit of mercy that he wanted the church to show.
Yeah, I thought he did that in a very bold way, not just the relics. He exhumed their bodies and processed them into the Vatican Square as a kind of a major example to the world. And so how correct my memory, or help my memory a little bit, but didn't he institute kind of ambassadors of mercy or messengers of mercy, and delegate particular priests to kind of be that apostolic witness of mercy in their particular diocese? How did that process work?
Right. I think every diocese, every religious order was invited to nominate priests to be these messengers of mercy.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to Rome, had an audience with the Pope, where he talked about the spirit of mercy that they were to show in the confessional. And then they sent them back to their home dioceses and their home countries. And he gave them, I don't remember all the specifics, but they had certain
powers invested in them.
Authority to forgive some sins that normally would have to be absolved only by the bishop.
Right.
And so, it was
a big deal at the time.
A big deal, yeah. And we had a number of friars in our own province who became missionaries of mercy, and a lot of, I think, 400 Capuchins, if I can remember correctly, from around the world became missionaries of mercy.
That's amazing.
Missionaries of mercy is what they called them, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. The other thing, and it goes back to the confession, because he obviously had a great love, respect for the sacrament of reconciliation. And when he talked to the Capuchins as a group, but not only Capuchins, also when he talked to other people, he would bring up the story of a Capuchin, an elderly Capuchin in Argentina, who his job at the time was to hear confessions all day long. I mean, basically, he was on call all day long in this shrine there in Argentina, and he confided once in, and this is before he was Pope, when he was the Archbishop in Buenos Aires. This priest confided in him once. He said, people come in sometimes and they have these terrible sins, and I kind of struggle with it. I absolve them, and send them away. He said, but sometimes I feel like I'm being too easy on them. And after I'm done at the end of the day, sometimes I go and I kneel down in front of the crucifix and I ask forgiveness for God. He said, today I think maybe I showed too much mercy today. Maybe I was too lenient today. And but then again, it's your fault. You set the bad example, Jesus. And Francis loved to tell that story. And to sort of say, follow that. Yeah. That's the example to follow. The one who forgave too easily.
Yeah. No, that's a really good story. I've never heard that told before, but it's hard for us to wrap our minds around, how generous God is to us, and in our Capuchin tradition, right, we're called to live that out, and in those times of great suffering, great pain, great sin, right, there we hope for God's mercy for all. So that's inspiring.
The other connection he had is not just with the Capuchins, but sort of the Franciscan family at large. Is he wrote these two encyclicals. One was Laudato Si, which is comes right from Saint Francis, from his praises.
Canticle of Creatures.
Canticle of the Creatures.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which starts out Laudato Si, mi Signore, and he uses that as a title of his encyclical about. A care for creation that we have to have, which of course is a theme that's very dear. It was very dear to Saint Francis, and is dear to us as Capuchins today. And he's not the first pope to talk about care for creation. Benedict was very strong on that as well, and Pope John Paul II before him was quite strong on that as well. It's been kind of a growing issue in the church. Francis certainly, he made it the whole topic of one of his encyclicals, so he obviously had a lot to say about that. Sure. But also Fratelli Tutti was another one of his, another one of his encyclicals.
So you're going to have to translate that for us, brother.
So it's to all my brothers, basically.
Okay.
We're all brothers. And
that sense of fraternity that he had
is taken right from Saint Francis. So there are all of these connections, and then at a very local level here, in a very personal level, I wouldn't be provincial minister today if it were not for Pope Francis.
That's right.
You know.
Yeah, can you maybe help some of those watching tonight live, or maybe that'll watch later, what that moment in time looks like, or why that's important for us as a province and for your own vocation?
Well, the fact of it is, so I'm not ordained. I'm not a priest, and in canon law, it's been the case for some centuries that in order to be the major superior, which a provincial minister is, the major superior of a clerical or a mixed congregation, which means that they're either all priests or they're priests and brothers, like the Franciscans are, you have to be a priest. You have to be ordained. And we, the Capuchins, and then after us, the Franciscans, and then pretty soon, almost all of the clerical and mixed institutes in the church began to ask the Holy See to change that rule, to make it so that also the lay brothers, the non-ordained brothers, could serve as superiors. And they instituted 2 or 3 commissions to study this all the time since John Paul II. They always promised us an answer. We never got the answer. It just kept dragging on and on and on. And so finally, in 2019, the dear brothers of my province decided to elect me, despite the fact that in our constitutions,
Well, it was probably because
allowed this.
It was probably because you were qualified, not just to push the envelope.
Well, yeah, you could speak to that more than I can. But they attempted to elect me anyway, despite the fact that it was still in canon law. It was still said they couldn't do it. And well, we had a cardinal, a friend of ours, who decided to become our advocate in this.
It's always good to have a cardinal friend in your back pocket.
Yeah. Well, in Rome, it's who you know, not what you know.
Sure.
And so our good friend Cardinal O'Malley, who was on the Council of Cardinals, which is a group of 7 or 8 cardinals who had advised the Pope. They met with him every 4, 5, 6 times a year, and so he was very close to Pope Francis. sit next to him at the table, and he took a letter, put it right into Pope Francis's hands, asking him to approve this request.
Wow.
And he did eventually, and so I was able to serve my first 3 years thanks to this grace that Pope Francis gave to us. And I don't know how I saw it as a grace. I'm not sure how the rest of you.
Sure, no, I was going to say, thanks be to God. That's an amazing story. I heard parts of that, but I haven't heard the whole story. That's cool.
And then just before the next chapter, when where we were elected new leadership again, and it was looking like, this time it may not be allowed. But then just weeks before the chapter, Pope Francis issued a change that said, from now on we're going to allow this, with certain conditions and so forth, but basically allowed it. So here I am today,
nice.
Thanks to Pope Francis.
No, that's really neat, and a lot of the way I kind of have described to some of our friends and benefactors, that don't understand kind of the distinctions, the vocation of lay brother versus priesthood. I just kind of point to Saint Francis, right? He's our first major superior. He embodies the charism of our spirituality, and he was a lay brother first. He was wanting to create an order of lesser brothers, little brothers, for the Catholic Church. So that's our first calling. Now, some of us choose to, serve as priests, which is a beautiful thing too. But we have many wonderful saints and lay brothers in the history of our church that have embodied the charism. And so why not administration? to me it's just common sense. But I know there's a bureaucracy and legality that matter, and so that was really neat that Pope Francis paused and reflected and saw the need and gave us that allowance and concession. I think that's really cool. So maybe you would, your name somewhere in a history book might end up in a footnote or about Franciscanism, or maybe a biography about Francis's pontificate. That's pretty
neat. I hope
neat.
it's in a good way. Yeah.
That's excellent.
But I had the opportunity last September when we had the general chapter in Rome, which is the gathering of all the leaders of the Capuchin order throughout the world, and we had an audience with Pope Francis, and so I was actually able to, we each got to go up and greet him, and for most people it was just a simple, glad to meet you, Holy Father, love you, whatever, and move on. But
you didn't weep when you saw him?
No, I did not weep. But
I would have been a nervous wreck, but it sounds like he held it together.
Well, yeah, it wasn't the first time I met him or the first pope.
Okay.
So
so you got a little bit of swagger there.
So I did say to him, I said, Holy Father, I said, I'm the brother that you allowed to serve as provincial minister 6 years ago or 5 years ago, even though I wasn't ordained. And I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity. And so he said, well, have you done a good job? And of course, by that time I was feeling kind of guilty. I was taking up too much of his time, so I was kind of moving away already. And I said, well, so, and which got a little smile out of him.
That's awesome.
The first time I met him, actually, because I had the opportunity to meet John Paul II twice and Pope Benedict once. But I was so tongue-tied. I tried to say something and nothing came out. And and plus they're so controlled. I mean, they have handlers, and so they've got time constraints, and so especially with Benedict, it was you had like 1 second.
Yeah.
And they just they'd start pulling you away. So there was really no chance. Francis did not like to be handled, and he wouldn't allow himself to be handled, really. And so he took as much time as it needed, And so the first time I met him, and I was thinking, I missed my opportunity with John Paul II to say something to get a response. I missed my opportunity with Benedict to say something to get a response. This time I have to say something that's going to get him to actually respond to me. And I thought, well, he's Latin. I think I know how to get to the Latins. So I got up to him and I said, Your Holiness, I said, I just want to let you know my mother prays for you every day. He said, oh, and he's grasping my hand, and he said, oh, your mother. Oh, what's her name? Oh, it's good. And how old is she? Oh, well, you tell her I pray for her. And finally he let go of me, I could move on. And it was a special moment.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. Yeah, no, those moments are filled with spontaneity and, tension and joy. And so, but that's great that he was able to give you that moment of respect and dignity and affirm you in the work, that you've done for us Capuchins. So, that's awesome. One of the questions that kind of came up for me as we were preparing for tonight's show, maybe is on the hearts and minds of some of our viewers tonight. Now that we're kind of in this process and stage of grieving the loss of Pope Francis, what are we to look forward to with this upcoming conclave? Is there anything on your mind, or kind of, you've seen now what you mentioned, 7 popes in your life, and so for most maybe new Catholics or maybe Catholics that never had an interest before are going to see this process of conclave unfold on our tablets, on our cell phones, and in the modern world. Yeah. So what are some of the expectations coming up?
Well, I think a lot of people have run to their Netflix account to see, to watch conclave, And actually, I saw it, and it's overdone. It's exaggerated, but I don't. It's not. It's not terribly far off of the truth. I mean, it's exaggerated, but. So now after the 9 days of mourning, after the funeral, they will gather together. They always hold the elections in the Sistine Chapel. There will be so all the cardinals who are under the age of 80 are eligible to vote in the conclave, where they elect a new pope. Right now, there are 135 cardinals in the world that are under the age of 80. Normally, they try to make it around 120, but it's just that recently they had the consistory where they made new cardinals, and they usually make more than 120, figuring that over time some of them are going to die and age out. Sure. And so we actually had 135 right now who are eligible to vote in the conclave. So they'll get together, as I said, in the Sistine Chapel. Conclave, the word conclave, comes from the Latin cum clave, which means key. With key. Yeah. So they actually they go into the Sistine Chapel, and once all of them are inside there, they lock the doors, and that is to maintain the secrecy. They have to take an oath of secrecy that they're going to keep everything that happens in there during and then even after the conclave for the rest of their lives. They're not allowed to say what happened within that room. So
So do they take an oath of secrecy?
They take an oath of secrecy.
Okay.
Yeah. And the reason, I mean, it's the same, the reason why they lock the doors and the reason why they take this oath of secrecy is to protect the process from outside influences.
Sure.
In the past, there was terrible interference on the parts of kings and emperors who were trying to, get the guy that was close to their political leanings elected the Pope. Mm-hmm. And so this is, they go in there, they pray to the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is supposed to be the only influence then on this voting process, so that they lock the door and they maintain this secrecy. It's not to be, lack of transparency or anything like that, but it's really to maintain the integrity of the process. Because if people think that somebody's going to reveal how I voted, that's already an influence. You feel somewhat constrained one way or the other. So to give them absolute freedom to vote their conscience without fearing that somebody's going to find out how I voted.
Yeah. No, I've heard of that process before. I remember kind of the conclave after John Paul II passed. But the new piece that I learned about, I was watching some reels on Instagram last night and learned about a Cardinal Camerlengo, a particular person that holds responsibility to take charge of the papal household while the death of the Pope and mourning is taking place for these 9 days. But one of the strange roles that he has, allegedly, is that when the death of the Pope is imminent or at hand, he has to strike the head of the dead Pope 3 times with a silver mallet and calls him by his baptismal name to make sure that bodily death has occurred. I've never heard that before. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And then once they take the body out of the room, they do seal it with a wax seal, so nobody is allowed to go into the room.
So we wouldn't let Brother Jude in there to get some relics off of him?
Well, maybe Jude might have his own key.
And then this Cardinal Camerlengo is responsible for breaking that seal that you mentioned, and also the Pope's ring. He wears the ring of Peter, which symbolizes that he's a fisherman or a fisher of men. And so that's interesting. I never had heard that process before.
Yeah. And so they start to vote, and it requires a 2/3 majority in order to be elected. So which is difficult in any circumstance. You just look at our elections here in the United States and how close they always are.
Sure.
A 2/3 majority, and you're talking here about a group of men who don't really know each other that well. I mean,
Right.
they've seen some of them. They've had interactions with some of them. Obviously, some are more famous than others. They've been on the news and so forth. So, but by and large, they may know a third of the men there, and so the first votes, they're really just trying to get a feel for, well, who has any kind of wind behind them,
Yeah.
And so and then hopefully with each subsequent vote, support will start to kind of fall on one person, or another, and so that eventually they can get down to the 2/3. And oddly, and this is probably something that not everybody knows, is they don't necessarily have to vote for another cardinal. They don't have to
Right.
vote for a cardinal. They can vote for any Catholic male
Baptized male, yeah.
who's over I think the age of 18.
So if you're watching tonight, get ready.
Yeah.
I'm just
And
kidding.
it has happened, very seldom, very, very seldom, but it has happened that they've elected somebody who was not even a priest. And
Right.
in those cases, then, after he's elected,
They
they
would
quickly ordain him
Yeah.
and make him a bishop, and then they make him the pope.
That's
Uh,
fascinating.
yeah.
How long does it take to elect a pope in your kind of times that you've seen the conclave unfold?
Well, in recent history, it's been like 2, 3, 4 days.
Mhm. Oh, okay.
Something like that. Not all that long.
So it's
but
like
then
waiting for an Amazon package to
Yeah,
arrive.
sort of like that. Yeah. No, and it may take 7, 8 votes, sometimes maybe 12 votes, something like that. That's recent years.
Mm.
But at one time in 1549, the conclave in 1549, there was these deep divisions. It was very poorly run. There was no secrecy. There was all kinds of shenanigans going on. It took 72 days to elect the pope, and then 10 years later, at the next conclave, it was even worse. It took 111 days.
Wow.
To elect the pope, and at a certain point, I mean, as I said, the conclave, to close that door with a key is to keep people from the outside going in, but at a certain point, it keeps them from going out, and they start to reduce the amount of food that they would bring into them. They would have fewer and fewer attendants to sort of help with their needs. They would start to close the windows so there would be less fresh air coming in.
Right.
So it was kind of like, come on, guys, it's time to make a decision here. And I heard that even at one point, the people of Rome got so fed up with it that they started taking the tiles off the roof of the Sistine Chapel so that it would rain in on them.
Wow.
To make it even more uncomfortable.
Talk about discerning the power of the Holy Spirit. That was a slow discernment there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found interesting in kind of researching myself is I found out that every cardinal that comes to the conclave has various officers or appointees that come with him, potentially a secretary, and then there's confessors, there's physicians, and there's even servants that are examined and appointed by a special commission, and they're walled off in the Vatican Palace while the conclave is going on for the cardinals. And so to me, that makes kind of historical sense of that moment in time that you mentioned, because if you're there for that long, things can happen.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's a little bit better now, I think, because they used to even have like rooms, I think, in the Sistine Chapel and then close by where they would even sleep and eat and everything. Now I think they can move around a little bit more.
No access to cell phones, or do they have cell phones?
No, I think all communication devices are taken away from them.
So does the Swiss Guard monitor that, or how does that happen?
I think they have these things, the electronic jammers in there, so that they can't use their cell phones even if they had them.
Okay.
They do put jammers in there.
That's going to cause some anxiety, I'm sure.
And then, so they vote, and after they voted, there's some of the cardinals who are in charge of this. They count the votes first to make sure that they got the proper number of ballots back. They didn't get too many back, and then they start to read off the names. And after each ballot is read, they stick a needle through the ballot and put it onto a thread, so that there's no chance that that's going to be read a second time.
Oh, wow.
And double counted that way. And then after all of the ballots have been read and they've been tallied up and the results announced, they take that stack of ballots, and there are stoves, cast iron stoves in the back of the Sistine Chapel where they burn them. And the chimney goes up and outside, and you can see the chimney from St. Peter's Square.
Right.
So
That's
people
what they
will stand in St. Peter's Square watching for the smoke, because they put certain chemicals in there with the ballots when they burn them, and one kind of chemical makes the smoke very black, and another kind of chemical makes the smoke look white.
Right.
And so black smoke means there's not been an election.
Right.
And a white smoke means there has been an election.
Yeah, I very much remember that live feed camera on one of the news stations during the conclave for Pope Benedict. I mean, so I felt bad for the cameraman because it was constantly, waiting for the smoke to emerge, and you get the live kind of ticker tape, breaking news, we don't have an election.
Right. Yeah.
I can remember that. So I'm going to imagine, similar kinds of things are going to happen on our news networks.
Right.
That anticipation of, do we elect somebody, or do the Cardinals elect somebody, or, how do we wait? So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And so then when there's an election, then of course he chooses his name, and they take him.
What's the phrase that they say, habemus papam?
Habemus papam, yes, we have a pope.
Nice.
But before he goes out to greet the people, they take him into a little room off the Sistine Chapel, which I think they call the Room of Tears.
Just to let him scream it out? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it's given that name because it's a hard job, and as I say, you lose your independence. You're basically handled for the rest of your life now, and
you're put on the cross for sure.
Yeah, it is a cross. Yeah. So shall we take some questions?
Sure. We want to encourage all of our viewers tonight to send in questions via email, also in the chat if you're watching live. We're always inspired by your questions and appreciate those send-ins. You want to take the first one there?
So Gene sends in by email. He says, what are your predictions for the next pope? Will he continue in the same spirit of Francis, or is the church looking for a more traditional leader?
I mean, my personal opinion is my hope. I don't necessarily have a prediction. I trust that God gives us the right person for the right reasons in the right kind of context of our time. So my hope is that we have somebody that can help us in our modern context. We've had, previous popes that have prepared us for the modern world, but now we even have kind of more relativism, more division, more struggles that the church is kind of pressing into. So hopefully somebody that can help us, preach the gospel in our modern times. To me, that would be my hope. And I know there's a lot of good cardinals out there that have those gifts. So, but I don't. My expectations aren't super high. I don't have one front runner. I'm not a gambler, so I don't know what the odds are in Vegas. But of who's going to be that leading cardinal. What about yourself?
Well, it's funny. Yesterday, I went down the rabbit hole, and I started looking at all these various news sources. So I picked 10 news sources from around the world, and one of them was actually ChatGPT.
Okay.
Which has an opinion on this. You surprised to me, but it's not crazy. I mean, it's true. ChatGPT has an opinion on this. And so these 10 news sources were some from Africa, some from Asia, America, Europe. There were 17 cardinals mentioned in these news sources. Pietro Parolin was mentioned in all 10, so which would kind of seem like it makes him a front runner. He's the current Secretary of State. He was appointed by Francis. He's seen as somebody very much in Francis's mold.
Is he Italian?
He's Italian.
Okay.
Very capable, apparently. He's run the shop really well. His problem is he doesn't have any pastoral experience. He's been sort of diplomatic, bureaucratic jobs all his life. And so some would see that as a detriment.
negative,
we need somebody with a pastoral heart. Another one that was mentioned very often was Luis Tagle, who's from the
Yeah.
Philippines.
I've heard his name thrown
He was
around.
mentioned 9 times.
Yeah.
Very pastoral. Also, they call him the Pope Francis of Asia. So some would see. I mean, if they're looking for a continuity candidate, he would look like he would be it. I think they might be worried a little bit about how he would handle the Roman bureaucracy, but that would have been Francis's problem too. And then the next one with the most number of mentions was Peter Erdo, who's from Hungary. And he was mentioned 7 times. He would be the more traditional leader. I think if people are looking, he's not way out there, but he would certainly be more traditional than Pope Francis was, at least the way, in his statements and so forth. It would seem that way. But, there are 2 caveats here. The first is that the Italians have a saying that the one who enters the conclave as pope comes out as cardinal. So somebody who is seen as the front runner going into the conclave, that's already one strike. It's almost as if there's a bias against electing the one that everybody expects them to elect.
Yep.
And so I think Paroline in this sense is already kind of handicapped, perhaps. The other thing that they say is, and I think is very true, that the office makes the man. So you can, and this has happened so many times in the history of the church. They elected a pope expecting him to be a certain way, and he turned out to be very different, because the office makes the man. So they can elect somebody they think is going to be more traditional, and he could surprise them in the other sense. Or they could elect somebody who they think is going to be a continuity candidate, carry on the work of Francis, and he could turn out to be very different. So,
Right.
it's not a straight line.
Yeah.
Well,
that's the exciting part, I think. Are there any religious in the running?
So there was among the Franciscans, one who comes up kind of mentioned quite a bit is Pier Battista Pizzaballa.
Whoa.
Who's the?
So wait. His name is Batista, like the WWF wrestler?
Well, Pier Battista. So
Okay, interesting. And then his last name is what?
Pizzaballa.
Pizzaballa. He's Italian?
It's Italian, of course.
Okay,
Yeah,
wow. He's got my vote.
So he's a Franciscan,
Even better.
and he's in the Holy Land. He's got a lot of international experience. I think it would be an interesting choice just because of all the trouble that are going on right now.
Yeah.
Sort of a sign of hope.
That's a powder cake for sure.
But he seems like he's been navigating that quite well. And then we actually have a Capuchin whose name comes up quite frequently. Well, among these 10 sources I looked at, he was mentioned twice, but he's come up in other contexts before, and that's Fridolin Mbongo Besungu.
Wow.
Who's I love these names, don't you? They rolls off your tongue.
Fridolin Mbongo Basungu. Okay.
He's from the Congo, and if you ideologically, if you try to pin him down, I think you'd have a hard time. He's probably more traditional than Pope Francis. He's the head of the African Bishops' Conference, and he's the one who went to Rome after Pope Francis issued the legislation where they allowed the blessings of same-sex of people who are in same-sex unions. He went and respectfully said, "We can't do this in Africa, and we're not going to do this in Africa." But he did it in such a respectful way that I think people on both sides appreciated that he didn't come out and publicly attack Francis and so forth. And we almost had him for dinner over here a couple weeks ago.
I remember that. We just missed him by a day or two.
We had a chance to maybe meet a future pope, and we missed it because he had to go back early. So,
well, one of the lessons I learned from tonight, Brother Mark, is it's always good to have a cardinal friend in your back pocket.
That's true.
So I appreciate your efforts in that.
There could be. I expect a surprise, and I kind of was laughing that I found out in doing research for this that Pope Francis, before he became a priest, was a bouncer in a nightclub for a while.
Wow.
He was, that's an interesting kind of background for a pope.
This is before he was a Jesuit?
Yeah, before he.
Okay.
Before he.
Because maybe he was a bouncer as a Jesuit. I don't know.
But another name that comes up once in a while is Cardinal Turkson,
Right.
from Ghana.
I've heard that name thrown around. Yeah.
He was a guitarist in a funk band, so that might actually kind of give him a leg up, From a bouncer to a guitarist in a funk band.
I like
it's
that.
Not that great of a leap.
We need a little bit more funk in our world, you know.
Right, yeah. Play that funky music, Papa.
I love it. I love it.
And so one last thing about this, I know that I'm going on pretty long about this, but I think our viewers might be interested, like, does any American have a chance? And I'm going to say no.
No, I would agree on that. Yeah.
I think our best chance in recent history would have been with Sean O'Malley. The Italians loved Sean O'Malley, and his name was all over the place at the last conclave. But it didn't happen. And why do I think it's unlikely that it's going to be an American? The conventional wisdom is America is already the military and the economic powerhouse of the world. We don't want to give them the spiritual power as well,
Yeah, I could see that.
So I don't think it's going to be an American.
Yeah, in some circles, people have mentioned Cardinal Burke as a potential, elector. But that's one cardinal I have met. I was in postulancy at the time when he was Archbishop of St. Louis, and I used to serve Mass for him. And he actually loves the Capuchins too. And my beard was much shorter at that time, but he tugged on my beard and he goes, "Good, a Capuchin with a beard. A Capuchin should always have a beard, And so, but we invited him over for dinner, and he was very, very friendly to us, very kind to us as brothers in St. Louis. So it would be nice to see somebody from the U.S. elected as pontiff, but I think you're right, Brother Mark, that most likely that power is going to shift to probably, I think it's going to shift back to Italy. But who knows? What God wills, his plan is better than my plan.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. We should take another question here.
Let's see here. It looks like there's one coming in from Cynthia here via email. Some of the things Pope Francis said or wrote stirred a lot of controversy. Can you explain what is meant by papal infallibility? Maybe we can do a podcast on that. That's a very complex question. Just to respond to that very, kind of briefly, a lot of what Pope Francis said or people respond to in a controversial way are kind of given by, little snippets or sound bites on social media or kind of a bias from the left or right. So I always encourage people to go back and study and read what Pope Francis wrote and taught. And there's a different meaning of papal infallibility when he speaks off the cuff, right? He's not teaching in the mode of pontiff, right? A pope can have an opinion. And so there are certain characteristics, certain kind of modalities when a pope is teaching in an infallible way. He has to be teaching from the chair of St. Peter. So a lot of people, I think, are confused by, when a pope says something, it's always infallible, and that's not necessarily the case. Go back and study church history. There's been some very sinful popes and very much popes that have erred. And so when he's teaching infallibly, he has to announce that. He has to be in union with the universal church and with all the bishops in the world, and there has to be a very clear kind of designation of when he's teaching in that infallibility context. And so, when an encyclical comes out or when a teaching comes out, I would say that's kind of an infallible modality, but that's usually kind of announced and presented to us in a very systematic way.
Right, yeah. I mean, there's even some dispute about, how many times the Pope has spoken infallibly in history, and some would say it's been very few.
Only
actually.
Twice, yeah.
And others would maybe expand it a little bit larger than that, but it's really not as if it happens every day or every month or every year. Even,
right. Or when the Pope is speaking, but in an interview on a plane ride.
Right, yeah. it's that is obvious. He's not on his seat,
Right.
so
Right.
it's not ex cathedra.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You want to take
But John, I think this is a somewhat snarky question here. But if communication is so important for evangelization, why does the Vatican website look like it was last updated in 1995?
Probably because they don't have a Capuchin in charge of it. Our website looks pretty good, I think. Check it out, by the way.
I think it was updated since 1995. But yeah, it's a very complex website, I guess, for one thing. So updating it would be a major undertaking, and I don't.
Does
think
it have Clippy? That's the key.
Yeah, no.
Do you remember Clippy
Yeah,
from the Microsoft Word program? The little the little helper that would help you design your page. Yeah.
Well, they probably could use some help in that regard.
Sure.
There.
Well, that's the invitation for the next generation, right? The age of the digital continent. We need apostolic men and women who have those gifts and talents to serve God and the church in that way. So maybe John can pray about that and see if there's a way that we can strive for perfection and organization on that platform.
Yeah. I mean, in all seriousness, I don't think they look at the website as a tool for evangelization so much as for information. But
Sure.
Anyway, perhaps that should change. I mean, it could be a tool for evangelization. I think many times they are. So
Exactly.
Yeah. So what do you
Awesome.
think will be the most significant issues and challenges the next Pope will need to address? That's from Rachel via email.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know the context of what other Christians are experiencing throughout the world, but, the humanitarian issues throughout the globe, the human trafficking, issues, the protection of life, the right to life, all those things, right? The evangelization, the economic injustices. So I think there's going to be some continuity, right? And doctrine doesn't change, it develops. So the next pontiff could develop more doctrine for us. But I don't see it changing in a whole, catastrophic continental shift way. I mean, that's my personal thought and opinion. I don't know how you think about that.
I mean, I'd say the number of issues. I mean, the whole question of the sexual abuse crisis is not over yet.
No, not at all.
That still needs to be addressed. There still needs to be progress made on that. Fortunately, I think, and it's been 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes. And so that's going to be an ongoing issue, I think. Pope Francis, I think he did a lot to try to get the Vatican finances and bureaucracy in a healthier place, but that is, any bureaucracy resists change.
Sure.
I think we're finding that out here in the U.S. right now as well, and but that's broken several popes trying to change the bureaucratic nature of the Vatican, the spirit there. But I think Pope Francis has made a lot of strides in rearranging things, streamlining things, and so forth. But that's not done yet either. So somebody needs to take that in hand and sort of kind of finish that as much as possible.
Well, I think even modern society is still struggling with that. That's an epidemic in all of our institutions and government and, law enforcement and our schools. I mean, it's an epidemic in the culture for sure. So I agree that that's not going away anytime soon.
Right, yeah. And we need to address the decline of Catholicism and Christianity in the West, and at the same time the explosive growth in Asia and Africa. That's going to be a huge factor for the next Pope.
Yeah, and then also maybe based on our last episode, if aliens arrive, the Pope might be the first to greet them.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen?
Right. All right, I think we've gone overtime today.
Absolutely, yeah. No, we want to thank all our guests tonight for joining us, and I want to encourage everybody in these next few days just to pray for Pope Francis, pray for his family and all those that are kind of grieving his loss, and we ask for the guidance of the Holy Spirit and the conclave, and If you're kind of anxious or struggling about that, remember that Jesus is in control, right? He's in charge of the church and world events, and we're lucky, right, to be able to watch that unfold, and all that's happening in the world is in God's hands. So we don't have to be overwhelmed, right? Remember how many times Jesus said, "Peace be with you." And this upcoming Sunday is Divine Mercy Sunday, and so we have to just trust that God is in control.
Yeah, amen. Right. So thank you for joining us this evening for this episode of In the Hood. And if you enjoyed it, we ask you to like and subscribe and share. Tell your friends about it. Also, watch some of our other series if you can. Our Good Morning, Good People, which is on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. A Simple Word, which comes out every Thursday, which is the gospel, a homily on the gospel of the coming Sunday, on our ministry series as well. And right now we have the Our Father series, which is going on daily. A little snippet on the Our Father daily from now until Pentecost,
Nice.
for the next almost 50 days. Normally at this time we would tell you what our next month's episode is going to be about, but because we had to pivot so quickly here, we haven't even had time to discuss how we're going to rearrange our schedule. So you'll be surprised to find out, and we will too maybe, to find out what our episode next month is going to be about. But we ask you to join us anyway next month, the third Thursday of the month, for the next episode of In the Hood. So thanks for
Awesome.
joining us this evening.
God bless you. Good night.
Good night.